Okay, we talked at a very high level about what Ajax is. Now let's look at how to actually do it in jQuery. So there's a function in jQuery called $.ajax. And it takes an anonymous object as an argument. And that anonymous object has two properties. The address on the server to call, on the same server that the HTML file was loaded from, and a JavaScript function to invoke once the process is complete. Let's look at that idea in a little more detail. So behind the scenes, JavaScript makes a network connection to the server. I say behind the scenes because the user stays on the page that they were looking at originally when this process starts. The page is not left. The page is not reloaded. Behind the scenes, JavaScript makes a network connection to the server, the same server that the HTML file was loaded from. When it gets to the server, it calls the address you specified with the URL option. And notice that that's a relative address. It's an address relative to the location of the HTML file. It's not an absolute address. And for security reasons, Ajax is prohibited from accessing URLs on servers other than the server that the HTML file came from. Okay, so call that address on the server, and then send the contents back to the browser. And when the process completes successfully, pass the contents of that address, the text of that address, what was inside that address, pass that text to the handler function. And then the handler function will do something hopefully interesting with it. Okay, a few quick notes before we try it. One is to notice that it's $.ajax. It's easy to forget that dot. It's not $Ajax. It's $.ajax. The other thing that it's easy to overlook is that you need curly braces in the function call. Technically, $.ajax takes a single argument, an anonymous object, and then that argument has various properties. Now, you usually think of $.ajax as taking various different arguments, URL, success, and some other ones we'll see later. But technically, it's a single argument that's an anonymous object, and it's the anonymous object that has various different properties. So don't forget the curly braces, and don't forget the dot after the $. All right, let's try this process out. All right, let's try things out interactively. So jQuery test, the file shown here on the screen, is the one that we looked at in the first section, which is just a simple HTML file that does not much else than load jQuery. It has a few interesting HTML tags in it, but it doesn't have any custom JavaScript. It just loads jQuery. It doesn't have any of our own JavaScript. We'll practice interactively before we try to make a file that calls jQuery from our own JavaScript code. All right, so if you recall, to launch it on the server, you right-click on Tomcat, you say Add and Remove, you give the project name, which in this case is jQuery Ajax, you move it over, you finish, right-click on Tomcat and say Start. Then you bring up a server and you say localhost, the name of the project, which in this case was jQuery Ajax. And we see a directory listing. Remember that you could make a file called index.html, and that would be the default file. But in this case, we get a directory listing. We bring up the test file, which basically just defines some simple HTML and loads jQuery. And then the key part is we bring up Firebug so we can try things out interactively. All right, so $.ajax takes an address on the server, and it takes a function that will be invoked when things come back successfully. All right, let's go back to our Eclipse environment and see if we have an address on the server that we can call. And I made one already. I made a little simple file called serverresults.txt. Notice it's in the same folder as the main HTML file. And that's a very simple text file that just says this is the result from the server. It's a simple text file. It doesn't run any server-side code. It's just a resource with a simple piece of content in it. It's not a full HTML file. It's just a little piece of data. All right, so let's go back to our main HTML page and see if we can invoke that resource via Ajax and show in the browser the result that comes back. So let's make a function, and we'll call the function My Ajax Handler. And the function that you invoke should take one argument, that is the text that comes back from the server. I said in the previous slide, when the process completes successfully, the contents of the server resource is passed to the function you specify. So I'll say it takes some text as an argument. And alert means pop up a little dialog box. So I'll say the result from the server is, plus, remember, means string concatenation if either of the arguments are strings. All right, so I define this function. I should test that function before I try it from Ajax. So let me just call My Ajax Handler hello. And sure enough, if you see at the top, it pops up a little dialog box that says the result from the server is hello. All right, so now let's try this process from Ajax instead of directly on the browser. And so remember, server result.txt is the name of the resource on the server. So I'll say $.ajax, notice the dot, parentheses, curly brace. The URL, the relative address is server-results.txt. And the success handler is the function we just wrote, My Ajax Handler. All right, and if this is successful, we will see a little dialog box at the top that shows the contents of that file with a little prefix in front of the text. So let's try it. And sure enough, the result from the server is, and it shows the text that came back from the server. So this verifies that we made a network connection behind the scenes to the server. We invoked that resource. We took the contents of that resource when it came back successfully, and we passed it to the handler function. So far, so good. Let's do one more change, and let's try an additional jQuery function that we already know about in our handler. So let me go back to my history, and let me go back to that function definition, and let me have it do something in addition. So if you recall from the basic section, we can use $sign to find HTML elements. And if you see at the top, the first H1 has class equals yellow. So let's remove that. Remove class yellow. All right, so now if I run the Ajax that I did before, first that yellow background text should turn to the normal background, and then the dialog box should pop up. So I run this. I go back into my history, and I make the Ajax call again, but I've redefined what the handler function does. And the dialog box pops up, but very quickly you saw behind the scenes beforehand that that heading no longer had a yellow background. All right, so the idea is practice interactively before you write a real program in a real HTML file to do it. And you say $.ajax, don't forget the dot. You have curly braces inside. That anonymous object inside takes two arguments. The first is the address on the server, and if you don't know how to write any real dynamic content on the server, which you probably don't, just make a simple text file. That's a relative address on the server relative to the location of the HTML page you're currently on. And then for success, you supply the name of a JavaScript function that you wrote. And preferably that JavaScript function takes some text as an argument and does something interesting with that text so that you can see that the content that came back from the server was actually passed to the function. Before we put this all together in a complete working example, let's mention a few more details and options. So the $.ajax function takes as an argument an anonymous object, something in curly braces that have properties. And there's no use in calling Ajax unless you say what address on the server you're going to run. And there's probably no use in calling Ajax unless you do something when the result comes back successfully. So you almost always apply the URL and the success properties of the object that's passed to $.ajax. Also notice that the handler function, the function specified with success, gets the text, the content of the resource on the server. Now that seems very natural, and that's the way that most people do it now. But if you've ever seen, or if some of your colleagues have tried to show you the way that it works in raw JavaScript without using jQuery, the handler function there gets past this XML HTTP request object, this confusing response object that you then have to look inside of and extract information from. We're not going to do it that way ever, but you may have seen other people do it. Your colleagues might be confused about why the jQuery version is so simple. So the text of the server result is what gets passed to the handler function. Also, we'll see later in the next lecture that you can specify the content type. In particular, we'll look at JSON. So right now, what's passed to the handler function is considered to be just plain text. But we can use an option that we'll see later called data type to say, hey, what's coming back from the server should not be interpreted as plain text. It should be interpreted as JSON, which we saw earlier, which can then be evaluated as a JavaScript object. We'll do that later. So URL and success are virtually always supplied in the object that's passed to $.ajax. But there's a few other options as well. You can say caching by the browser should be turned off. I'll explain what that is in the next section. You can pass some data to the server. This is very important. You can specify what kind of data is coming back from the server. In other words, rather than plain text, it's JSON. You can have a handler that says what to do if the process breaks, if it's unsuccessful, if the server times out, or if the server refuses a connection, and so forth. You can have an error handler. So those 4 additional options are moderately often used, and then there's some less used options as well. So a quick example would be, go to the server and invoke this relative address. If everything is hunky-dory, if the server doesn't time out, if the server doesn't refuse a connection, if there's no HTTP error, then take the content of that address and pass it to the first function. But if there's a problem, in particular an HTTP error, or the server just times out, then call the second function. Now there's no text to pass to the second function. There's no, server content to pass, but you can still say, hey, something failed and here is the status code and please try again later, or something like that. So URL and success are always supplied, but an error handler, if something goes wrong, if the server is temporarily down, if the server is overloaded, is also a good idea in real-life applications. So in our previous examples, and in fact in probably 98% of all examples you'll ever do in real life, you use the simplest form of a response handler function, the function that's passed to the success property. And in the simplest form, the function takes a single argument. It's the content that comes back from the server, which for now is plain text, but later on we'll see that it also can be something like XML or JSON. But a single argument, the content of the resource that we specified on the server. So the example that we did interactively was something very similar to this. We made a function that took a single argument. We did something with that argument. And then when we called a success handler, we specified the function that we had just defined. And that's the simplest way, and that's the way you do it 95% of the time in real life. But there are some more complex options for response handlers. The first is that you can define a response handler function that takes 3 arguments instead of 1 argument. In fact, in the previous version, where we defined 1 argument, jQuery actually passed it 3 arguments, even though we defined it with 1, and so the second 2 arguments were just ignored. But jQuery actually calls it with 3 arguments every time. And occasionally, you want to make use of those other 2 arguments, and so you can define your response handler function to take 3 arguments. You can get a status string, and for people who are really hardcore Ajax programmers that have experience with the kind of underlying request object, you can look at the request object. I just want to mention this is possible to preview some advanced capabilities, but we're never going to do this, and you rarely do this in real life, but it's useful to know that it's possible. Another thing that's useful to do is to specify more than 1 function as the success handlers. So you supply an array of functions. Now, most of the time, you don't do this. Most of the time, you just make a single function that inside of it calls other functions. Just like when we did it interactively, we first made a handler function that popped up a dialog box, and then we edited our handler function so it did an additional task. But occasionally you've already defined some handler functions for other purposes, and so you just pass a group of them to the success handler. Neither of these is very are very common, but these options are worth knowing about. What's also worth knowing about, or just being aware of, is how much simpler the jQuery version is than the way to do it in actual raw JavaScript. In other words, what jQuery does internally is a lot more complicated than what we do making use of jQuery. So hopefully you will never have to suffer through this directly, but those programmers who started off before jQuery was around or were not aware of jQuery, in ordinary basic JavaScript, you had to do this long, complicated process. I'm not going to walk you through it. It doesn't really matter. Just be aware that it's long and complicated, and that it requires you to make an anonymous function that captures a local variable. And if you recall from our JavaScript section, an anonymous function that captures a local variable was called a closure. So this whole process is complicated and is hard to understand. And so jQuery came along and said, well, instead of that big, long, complicated process, we'll do this 1 line. And this 1 line is equivalent, or is actually a little bit better because it gets the response text automatically, than the entire previous slide. So just call this address on the server, take the contents of that address, and pass it to this function.